Good morning, students. My name is Charles Wolf, and I'm recording from my upstairs bedroom at my house in rural eastern Jennings County. Today, we will cover processes that influence congressional elections, incumbency advantage, open and closed primaries, caucuses, and general elections. Modern presidential elections feature distinct stages with different processes: exploratory campaigning and fundraising, intra-party elections via direct primary or caucus. Remember, that's when each state has its own election within the party to decide who their candidate will be. They also hold inter-party debates and appearances, all leading up to the general election. Moving on here. So, there are three distinct types of behaviors to look at here. The first being incumbent behavior. Incumbents, remember, are the people that are already in office. Incumbency advantage phenomenon refers to things that are meant to or viewed as things that help incumbents, such as name recognition and franking privilege, significant amounts of time spent fundraising. A quote from former Representative Eric Massa states, quote, "Congressmen spend between 5 and 7 hours a day on the phone begging for money." State election impacts. The nomination process. Does your state use a caucus, a primary, a convention, or canvass? Open versus closed primaries, which an open primary is where you can vote in the primary of any party, no matter how you're registered, whereas a closed primary is in a state where you have to register for one party or the other. Also, getting on the ballot. People in each state have to receive enough signatures of constituents showing they might support them in order to qualify for the ballot. The general election can be impacted by how the ballot is structured and the election timing. When does your state's primary election take place? Linkage institutions, we've talked about in the past, things that link people to politics. We have special interest groups and parties. They make endorsements, mobilization, meaning they mobilize people for their cause, going public, sharing information with the public, financing, a la fundraising, media coverage, and debates. All of these are things that impact this election process. Moving on. So this chart shows the rate of congressional incumbent re-election. Okay, so looking at it, we want to know, what is the average trend? If we look here, it shows that over time, re-election percentages have gone up. What are the deviations from trends, and do they follow a pattern? Can we draw any conclusions from the trends and the patterns? So we've got two lines that show where the average is. Now this is easy any math because on the test we probably won't have time. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to draw a line that has as many points above as below so that I can get an average trend to see if I have a positive or negative association. And here what I can tell is that in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, incumbents over time since the year of our Lord 1948 are more likely to be reelected, with obviously the Senate having the steepest positive association here. All right. This can be seen very closely to home here in Indiana, right? If we look at Illinois, we have Senator Dick Durbin, who's been in the office for over 30 years. And to the south in Kentucky, we're all familiar with our favorite turtle himself, Mitch McConnell, who has been in office for as long as all of us have been alive. Okay? So, some other interesting trends that we can see. We can, for instance, see that there is a significant dip in re-election around 1980. And we might want to be able to, again, draw some conclusions for that dip. What was happening in that election year that caused a lower rate of re-election for incumbents? Before I get too far, it's important to note that it's not like nobody was reelected. Still, we're looking at plus more than 50% of incumbents were reelected. But maybe around 45% of them were not. And a lot of that might have to do with the president, with the presidential candidate that was up the ballot from them. In this case, it would be Ronald Reagan. Something about that candidacy of that Republican running for president would have a significant down ballot effect. Obviously, in this 1980 election, if you don't know, Ronald Reagan was exceptionally successful and kind of wiped the floor with Democratic incumbent Jimmy Carter. So in this case, Democrats may have been negatively affected by the massive support from even some members of their own party for Reagan. Down the ballot, this affected members of Congress, and that shows how the presidential election in years that do have presidential elections can affect congressional elections down the ballot. Okay? So, what contributes to our trends in terms of incumbent reelection? Okay, we have campaign finance. Transparency requirements are minimal, meaning that the amount of transparency or openness or willingness to show that candidates have to have for where their money is coming from is pretty minimal. Okay, this is also impacted by diverse state law. Each state has its own kind of rules and regulations on campaign financing. Federal cases influence the role of money in politics. We've talked about in the past, Citizens United versus the Federal Elections Commission. Nationalization of congressional races, right? When we think of Congress, in the Senate, obviously, 2 people cover the entire state. But in the House of Representatives, your state can be divided into as many as 20 districts, depending on some states. Outside donations, as we saw in the documentary we watched earlier this semester, can have a major impact on these congressional races, and they can basically be influenced heavily by people that truthfully have no horse in the race for what goes on in that state. They just want their party to have a majority in Washington. Therefore, somebody in New York might be heavily interested in the Indiana Senate race, for example. Partisanship in elections, geographic and ideological self-sorting. Okay, for example, if you look at an election map in Indiana for our state elections, you'll find Democrats tend to win better in more urban areas. Think of like Bloomington, where Indiana University is, or the Indianapolis metro area, or Northwest Indiana, what's called the region, that is close to Chicago and part of the Chicago metropolitan area. These urban settings typically have a higher Democratic success rate, whereas more rural counties like Jennings County, where we're at, can tend to be more Republican. So, things we've talked about. There are processes that influence congressional elections, okay? The processes of fundraising, the processes of presidential elections taking place certain years, okay? We've talked about the advantages that incumbents can have, open and closed primaries and the differences between those, caucuses, and general elections. Bye, friends. Make good choices.